Hello and welcome to JavaScript Marathon Training presented by This.Labs. I'm Sarah with This.Labs and I will be your host. Our next session is building clean forms using Angular. And today's trainer is Trześniewski, Senior Software Engineer at This. Welcome. I hope I didn't butcher your name too bad, Chris.
Hello.
You can find Chris on the Twitter using the handle shown at the bottom of the screen. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or feedback. JavaScript Marathon would not be possible without our sponsors. Our sponsor today is This.Labs, your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. This.Labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. If you find keeping up with constantly evolving technologies a struggle and want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies, contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. We have a ton of upcoming events for 2021. Our next week is State of Vue Community on the 28th. And also Angular Contributor Days is coming up February 4th. For more details, head on over to this.co. And JavaScript Marathon returns Wednesday, March 24th. Follow us on This.Labs on Twitter for more details. And with that, I'm going to hand it on over to Chris.
Hello, everyone. Nice to greet you all. So today, as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about building clean forms using Angular. So without further ado, let's just get started. So today's agenda is first, I'm going to talk about a little overview about other ways to handle forms in Angular that I'm not going to cover in depth in this talk. Then I'm going to talk more in depth about reactive forms in general, which are the topic of topic of this training. I will present to you what form objects are. And then we're going to move to a live coding session in which we're going to build a reactive form. We're going to group common parts of it that can be extracted. And finally, we're going to create a custom control, which is going to behave like the native one. And at the end, we have a block for Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please save them for later. So let's start with the overview. So when we create forms or work with form elements in Angular, we, of course, can use native inputs and events that they provide, which, for example, is value input, change event, input event. But this is very cumbersome, and the interfaces between specific elements might differ. So this is an example of using just a regular text input. So we can put our variable name inside of it as a value and react to change events using the change output. But if we want to handle more than one variable, it's gonna become really hard. So Angular provides us with with two ways of handling forms. One of them is template-driven forms. So it basically creates a common interface for all native elements, and we can interact with them via an ng model directive. It is good for simple use cases with few fields, but doesn't scale well. It has implicit access to the underlying form objects, which we will cover in the later slides. And this is the example code of how we could handle one input. In this case, we have an ng model. Directive, which has this Angular specific syntax which is often called banana in the box. So it basically is in both input and output, and this value will be synced across if we change it either in the parent component or whether the inputs changes itself. And we can also apply some validation via the template. So this field will be required and has a minimum length of 4. And we can access for example, the validity status via the name tag here, and it's exposed via ngModel variable. So here we can also set some validation messages if the entered value is not correct. But all the form object, the whole form object is handled within the directive itself. So we don't have explicit access to it. We have to use this tag here to access. So in this presentation, I would like to focus more on the reactive forms, which provide us an explicit and direct access to the underlying form objects. It scales well, thus it fits more complex use cases. And a simple example of the form which we already of the use case which we already covered before with one field is shown here. So we have to define a form object inside of our component class. In this case, we call it just form, and we mark as our form with the form group directive that everything under this form will be handled by a form object of form, and every next call or when we try to access something within that, we will base it on the form object. So this form control name here is basically a form.name, and yeah, so this is so we have explicit access to this form and all its children. So both template-driven and reactive forms are built on top of the same building blocks, which are form objects. And with templates, as I have said before, template-driven forms operate on that implicitly, and in reactive forms approach, we do handle that explicitly. So what are form objects here? So they are basically some classes which we use for storing the underlying data and status of the form. For example, its validity. And we have, well, actually 3 types of concrete form objects. And one abstract class which basically binds them all together. So abstract control is just a basic class from which all other objects derive from. And form control basically tracks a single value and its status. We have 2 objects for tracking collections of controls. One of them is form group, which handles them in an key value manner. And we have form array, which tracks an array of controls. And the bridge between form control and DOM elements is handled via a ControlValueAccessor interface. So in order to tell Angular how to handle the communication between DOM elements and form controls, we need to implement this interface. So let's see some reactive forms in action. This is where the live code session begins. So let's start with creating a simple form. I've scaffolded a bit of code in here. So we want to present or we want to get from the user his personal information. Let's assume this is a application which is an online shopping cart. So we want to send some products to our client. We need his first name, last name, and mobile phone. And we also are going to need his billing address and shipping address. And both of those will contain street, city, state, and zip code. So let's start building that up. So form field, I just created some helper classes to format this so that it's going to look a bit better. So first name, and then we're going to need an input with form control name. And here we need to put a first name. And let's duplicate that 3 times. Last name. And phone number, mobile phone number. Mobile phone number. Phone number. This. Mobile phone. So we need to define those form controls which are going to handle our form. So let's go to quickly to the class. I started a form group in here, but it doesn't have any fields. So we need to create a first name and then new form control because it contains only one value. And we're going to initialize it with empty string. Same goes for last name and mobile phone. For billing and shipping address, we're going to just start that by creating a form group, billing address, which is going to be empty for now. Form group. And same goes for shipping address. Okay. So let's start building those. I'm just going to copy this so we don't have to type everything by hand. So this is going to be street and form control name is going to be street as well. And 4 fields in here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's going to be city. and state and zip code. So let's field correctly: city, state, zip code. And basically the same template is going to apply to our shipping address. So we already can see some duplication in code here, which we're going to tackle a bit later. So now we need to fill in our billing and shipping address form objects. So let's start with street, city, state, and zip code. And I'm gonna multi-line edit that. New form control. And basically the same object goes into our shipping address. So let's just paste that in. And with all of that, we should be seeing cannot find control with name streets. Probably I made a typo somewhere. Street. Okay, so because those shipping, this shipping address and billing address live under separate form groups, we need to tell Angular that we want those form control names to refer to billing address in this case and shipping address in this case. So there is another directive called form group name, and here we can use billing address. And for our shipping address, form group name equals shipping address. Hope I didn't make any typo. Yep, no errors in the console. And when we type Chris here, Trześniewski, so we can see that the value is updated. We can also easily apply some validation in here by basically adding a second parameter to our form controls, like, for example, validators required. And this is gonna basically render an error, or we might render an error based on that in here. So I'm gonna just form group controls first name but errors. And after the render, we can see that we actually get some error object, which then we can handle and display error messages based on that. So we've covered a basic example of using a bit more complex form, but as you might already have seen, we have some duplication in here. So both billing and shipping address contain basically the same fields. They are only living under different form groups in our root form. So we might want to extract that into separate component, and we're gonna just do that. So I'm gonna add a new component, and call it address form. I'm gonna show you two approaches to that, and I'm gonna export it so that we have access to it, so that we can use it in our templates outside of the module. So, oops, it was supposed to be elsewhere. Probably mobile phone address module. I think it added it here. So remove that. Oh. And export is not needed. So I'm gonna put it under address, component, address, form on, export. So it should create it under this folder. Yep, we've got our address form component, and it's exported in our address module, which I've created before. So let's just start by copying over the template from our user form address. So let's use the billing address as an example, and just get all the form fields. I'm just going to copy it over to here. And just leave it like that for the time being. I'm not going to need all those interfaces implemented. And let's just try to use it. So I'm gonna do app address form 1 in here, and comment out this thingy. So right after it refreshes, we get an error that basically form control name must be used with a parent form group directive, which basically means that when we wrapped this template with this component, we lost handle to our billing address form group. So how can we tackle that? Let's start simple by just putting an input in here, call it group, and just get our form group, get, and just use billing address in here. So we must implement this input in our components. So let's add it, input, and we call it group, and it's going to be a form group. And let's assume that it's going to be always present just for the simplicity of typing. Then we need to pass this form group, which we are given via an input, to our form in here. So the simplest way to do that is to wrap our whole template with ng container, which is basically an element which won't be rendered into the DOM, but will group all of our scope of our template underneath. So let's use form group in here and pass in a group. You might ask why we didn't call it form group for the sake of using the same interface. Well, we cannot do that because the form group, when we try to add a form group attribute, Angular is gonna read that as a form group directive, which we cannot and we cannot override this behavior. So it's gonna expect some interfaces to be implemented. So we basically need to call it differently. And with that change, we should be good to go. So street, I don't know, First Avenue. I'm not familiar with US addresses, so bear that in mind. Yep. So as you can see, the values in our inputs are reflected in the billing address form, and we can basically reuse that easily by just changing the field in here. So we can call it shipping address, and just put it inside of our second element, and remove all the remaining boilerplate. So we already end up with much cleaner code, but the drawback of this approach is that we basically introduce another interface for so the consumer of this component must be aware that this cannot be used with the form with the native or provided by Angular interfaces. But we can iterate on that and basically make our second address form component to handle that within the with the same interface as we did before. So with just form group name in here, and we will make it work out of the box. So let's start. Let's add another component. I'm gonna call it address form 2, and export it as well. So it's not gonna be different in terms of template. So we can just copy over the template from this component into this component. Let's add it here. And we need to somehow get this group in here. So let's just start with defining it so that Angular compiler doesn't complain. So I'm going to call it group. Group. Again, we need to tell that we are aware that this is going to be initialized later on. And to get access to the form group that is given to us from the parent form, we can use the dependency injection provided by Angular, and basically whenever an address form component is included within a form, we can inject a private control container which is a class control container. We could mark it optional so that whenever our address form component is not placed within another form, we can throw some meaningful error for the user to let the user know. Or we could default to form group in here with some predefined controls. So I'm gonna. So we don't have access to the underlining control right away. We only get access to it in the ng on init hook. So we can assign our group to this control container control, and we need to explicitly cast it as form group. We just know that it's gonna be a form group. If it's not, then it's basically not gonna work. And I'm gonna remove this. Okay, so basically with just adding few more lines instead of just passing an input, we can now use our second address form component within our user form, and let's call it address form 2, and we can get rid of this input. So when we get a new refreshed page, we don't get any errors in here, and we put it under a shipping address. So let's see here, Second Avenue, and as you can see, it is already bound to our shipping address form group. The benefit of this approach is that we can either put this under another form group name, but we could also put it directly within our form. So if we don't want to group those fields under another form group, we could put them directly in the template, and then we just need to define those fields directly on the template. So let's add it here. And I'm going to add another H3 here so that we can see something. Direct address. Okay, it's not, I need to with diff column. So it's look nicer. Okay, so now we can see that this is our direct address, and this is stored directly in our root form group. So with this approach, we don't have to worry about adding a separate input, and we can easily add our address either under some nested form group or directly in our form. Okay, so that concludes the grouping part of this talk. If you have any questions so far, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comment section, and I will answer them at the end. So as you might have seen in the form component in here, user form we also have a field called mobile phone, and for now it's just a text input, but let's assume that we want to format it for to resemble the real phone number. So I will put in the Polish phone because I know the exact format. So if we want to format the mobile phone, it should appear in a format like this, and we should not shouldn't be able to just trim it like that. So to achieve that, we could put all of that logic within our user form component. But as this logic grows and as we get more components that might need different handling, we will basically break a single responsibility principle, and with growing number of fields and complexity, this component might grow pretty fast and become unmanageable pretty soon. So the good approach is to basically separate it into a new custom component and try to implement it in such a way that it's gonna be let's say transparent to the component that is using that, so it will act as a regular input or select or whatever native component we could use. And to do that, let's start by basically creating a new component. Let's call it mobile phone exported, and I'm gonna add flat because I started with this folder. Yep. So what do we need to do in order to make our component talk with Angular and bridge the interface we need for it to the Reactive Forms or template-driven forms that Angular provides us? As I've said in the presentation before, there is an interface called ControlValueAccessor, which we basically need to implement. And if we use our IDE to implement all members, we can see that we need to implement write value, register OnChange, register OnTouched, and optional set disabled state. So let's just go right ahead and implement those. Yep. So register OnChange is this pattern is gonna be used in probably almost every custom form control that you might create. So we need two callbacks called on change, which is gonna be we could type it as any just for simplicity, and on touched, which is basically whenever we focus and then unfocus the input, we do emit on we should emit untouched. Yeah, so just to register that, we can just assign on change to our function and do similar for untouched. Set disabled state. So let's start implementing our internals of our controls. So it's gonna be super simple. We actually just need an input, and we need to pass a form control to it. So let's call it phone control. So we need to now define it in here. Private phone control equals new form control. Let's initialize it with an empty string. And then we have our control in our template. We have our input. Now we just need to synchronize this phone control, which is internally handled. So whenever we type something into this input, this phone control is going to reflect that. And we somehow need to set the incoming values for this phone control. And whenever this phone control changes its value, we need to notify the parent component of or parent control of this event. So we can do this. The incoming changes is easy. We can just use our write value method. And for now, just let's use our phone control, and we can use set value methods on it, and use our object provided. And we need to pass a second argument in here so that we don't end up with an infinite loop of changes. So we're gonna say emit changes false. This is gonna prevent the form control from emitting the event back to the parent control, and then parent control might try to put that value in again, and we might end up in an infinite loop. So this is just a safety check. And we are here, so we could also implement set disabled state. We are given just a Boolean value, so we can just use is disabled and ternary operator to just either disable it or this phone control label. Okie doke. So now, if we want to use it, let's try in our form control, in our user form. Let's put it as a separate field for now. So I'm gonna duplicate this for mobile phone number 2 to and let's define this field in here. So mobile phone 2. So let's look at our so if we start by just putting 3, 4, 5 in here, it will be reflected in here. But whenever we do any changes, it's actually reflected for some reason. Probably I forgot to use the actual form control. Where is it? Okay, so it should be up mobile phone. Okay. So no value accessor for form control with name mobile phone 2. So we did actually implement the interface, but we need to tell Angular we need to tell Angular's dependency injection that whenever we want to access form control for this component, we want to use basically this instance of a component as a value accessor. It's a bit convoluted, but basically it's pretty repetitive. So we just need to define providers array for our component and put a new provider in here, which is basically us telling Angular that we want it to use something as a token, and it provides us with ngValueAccessor token, and we need to provide it whenever Angular wants to access this ngValueAccessor for our component. We want to use this exact instance of it. So we must use the useExisting property in here. We cannot use, for example, useClass, because then Angular would spin up just another instance of this class. And because we are just defining this class in here, so we cannot directly say mobile phone in component in here, because it's gonna Angular compiler won't know how to resolve that ahead of time. So we need to do this kind of trick to forward reference this mobile phone input. So basically, Angular is gonna resolve that later on and call this function when our mobile phone component is already declared. So by adding this and also a third property called MultiToTrue, by default, when we use provide, it will override the previously defined value, but we want Angular to store it additionally to all the value accessors that it's already using. So whenever we add a new custom component, we want to add its value accessor to the array of existing ones. So this is a way to handle that. So now we should be left without errors. And let's see. As you can see, the value is properly propagated to the input, but whenever we change it here, it doesn't tell the parent component back that it has changed. So we need to implement some kind of reaction to changes for our phone control. We can do that in the ng-on-init hook. So we basically need to access an observable exposed by a control called value changes, and it basically is going to emit every time that the underlying value changes. So we can use pipe operator in here. This is going to be, we could do that all in one subscribe, but I just like splitting that into separate functions. So first, let's tab, and this is just an operator for performing side effects. So we get a value in here, which is a value which is emitted from these value changes, and we can do anything with that. So let's just call OnChange with this value. and we can subscribe. There is one problem in here that whenever we subscribe to any observable within the component, we need to make sure that when the component is destroyed or whenever we want to, this subscription is terminated. So in order to do that, we can use another hook, ng on destroy. It's returning void, and we should put on destroy here so include doesn't complain. And basically there are few patterns for doing so, but I like to use take until and then put this destroyed subject in here. So we need to define this subject, private destroyed new subject, and this is also something repetitive. So every time you subscribe, you either need to use a take until, or you need to store the actual subscription, and then within on destroy you can unsubscribe from it. So there are two main approaches to this, and basically whenever we destroy a component, we push an event in here, and this subscription will be terminated upon the first emission of this observable. So this is just a pattern that you can reuse everywhere, basically. And right now, we should see that our changes to this component are reflected in our mobile phone too. But right now, we basically reproduced the exact implementation of input and wrapped it in our components, so we don't get any benefits so far. What we wanted to do in the beginning is basically format whenever we change a value outside from of our new custom component. We want to format it here so that it is displayed in a manner in a proper manner for every country. So I've already we shouldn't reinvent the wheel for that. There is a library for handling phone numbers. It's called libphoneNumber.js, and I'm just gonna pull in this dependency. So we have a libphoneNumber.js, and we have a few functions in here. One of them is parse phone number, and the other one is format incomplete form for phone number. So we're gonna use that to format the number as we type it in. So let's start with that. So in our value changes stream, before we actually call OnChange, we can plug into this stream and do something. So let's start with this write value. So whenever a value changes in here, we want to format it properly. So let's just use no, sorry. Okay, write value is just a function that I was gonna create. So let's implement, no. Okay. So whenever we change anything, we want to put it back into our phone control, and we can do the formatting inside of our write values. So this way, whenever the phone control changes itself, or the underlining input is changed by the user, or whenever we pass in the value from outside, we format it properly. So let's use our setter in here and just maybe formatted string. And we can actually just use format number. And put object in here. Okay, this is another helper function. Sorry for that. We actually don't need to use that. Just format incomplete phone number, and by default, let's try to format it in for United States. And this is returning a string. So yeah, we are safe in here. So we can just pass it as a value in here, formatted string. And now format number is not defined. This is okay. So we were given a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we format it in this manner. If we try to input let's say a Polish phone number, as I've shown you before, it starts with +48, then we type some number, and as I type, it's already formatted. So this basically gives us a way to make sure that the number is displayed correctly to the user. But one more thing that we can implement in here is basically adding a validation. And to do so, we can implement another interface called vali. Let me just make sure validator forms. And we need to implement all prior members. So basically, a validation function is just a function that takes a control and returns either an error, which is anything but null, or null if the control is valid. So we can use our parse, our phone number JS, our phone number JS library to do so. Let's put our const parsed. I think we can just use it like that. Const formatted string. Parse phone number. Okay. Control dot value. And this might return us a null if or undefined if it cannot parse the given value yet. So in our return, we need to account for that. So if our parsed is undefined, we default to an invalid state. So first and is valid, then null, or return some kind of object, mobile phone, true. Basically, the shape of this is defined by us. If we want to pass in some message in here, we could, so that the recipient of that validation error can, I don't know, format it in a meaningful way. But for our use case, let's just keep it simple. With just phone number, mobile phone, true. And now we can try displaying that in our form in here. So next to our form group controls, phone number 2, display errors. Of undefined, maybe we should do I think mobile phone too. Okay, so now I'm not sure what's happening in here. Validate parse number. Let me just copy over from the example I just implemented before. Validate. We can remove that. Okay. Again, we didn't provide a proper provider. So additionally to implementing the interface, we again need to provide an exact token that Angular expects us to. So in this case, instead of ngValueAccessor, we need to provide it with ngValidators. And again, use existing and multi as we did before. Okie doke. Okay, so now we are getting this error, but it's basically because the validator is added after we initialize our parent control. We could handle that by just triggering one more change detection cycle in ng after view init. Void, we need to pull in the change detection reference in structure private reference change detection reference changes this CDR changes implements after view init. Now we don't get an error anymore, and as you can see, the number 12345 is not a valid phone number. We need to provide some more values in here so that it's actually valid. So this seems to be a valid US number, and if we want to put a Polish one, we can type, I don't know, 777 786 444444. This is a valid number. If we remove that, it's not a valid one. Yeah, and we can of course display a proper message for the user to know that they need to provide a valid phone number. So yeah, we covered how to extract groups of fields so that we don't have to repeat our code with, in this case, with address form component. And we also covered how to create a simple custom component which can handle some internal formatting and validation. And all of that uses basically the same interface as all the other input selects and all the other native components. So we don't differ in how we need to use them. So this concludes, I did all of this code in slides just in case. So this concludes my presentation. I basically based this on mostly Angular documentation, which is reactive forms and form validation. And for the control container, this was present in the documentation, but I had to figure it out myself. So this is time for the questions. If you have any, I will just see in the section in here. Zach Wilson just started learning Angular, only touched the basics, so this is a bit over my head. I hope it will resonate with you as well. Kizar Iqbal, hi all, I wish I could watch. Okay, it's not a question as well. So if you have any questions right now, please put them in the comments section. We will wait here for a couple of minutes just in case.
Yep, we do need to wrap up. So if you do have some questions, go ahead and put that in there now. If we don't get to them now, go ahead and hit up Chris on Twitter. If you're watching this later as well, you can also reach him on Twitter. Chris, what a great session. And this was your first JavaScript Marathon session. So wonderful time. You did a great job. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them. If we don't get them to them now, we will follow up later. So thank you everyone for coming. We're going to actually be back in about 20 minutes with Kelly Mahoney. She is going to be talking about web design and CSS. So hope you'll join us in a couple, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Chris, and we'll see y'all soon.